So this video is a short video to take you through the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations budget planning process. So we're going to go through a budget plan, which is a top-down budget, and follow that process right through. But first of all, we're going to have a look at some of the configuration that we have to do behind the scenes to make this all work. So it is a quite high level review of the configuration, but let's have a look at that and then we'll begin our actual forecast plan. So using our workspace, we're going to go into budget planning configuration. And first of all, what we want to point out is the second one on the list is scenarios. So in this particular example, we do have various different scenarios that we're going to be using, predominantly an actuals scenario. We're also going to build in a budgeting scenario. So we're going to create a forecast here where the first 2 months are actuals data, January and February 2018, and the rest of the forecast is budgeted data for the rest of the year. We're also going to touch upon some of these other types of scenarios as we go through the top-down process. But two other scenarios that are key to this demonstration are how we can use scenarios that are quantity-based. So where we have here, as an example, we have a loss ratio. And we're storing some data in there that we can use later on as a potential for business drivers, so driver-based forecasting. And the other one that's of the same sort of setup is market share percentage. So we've got a couple of scenarios there that we'll bring into this particular demonstration. We also are making use of workflow stages. So we'll see that this budget that we're going to work with starts with the finance department at the top. They create the initial budget, and that will have a status of or a stage of initial. They will distribute that down into the relevant departments, because that's how our top-down budget is going to work. The departments will review each of their individual budgeting scenarios and submit that for approval. And it will go back to the finance department and they will have a stage of aggregation. So they'll aggregate each of the departments together, and that will go for a CFO review, who will finally approve that particular business plan. And the final step will be we will then publish that to the budget register entries within Dynamics, so that we can then instigate all the control around that budget. So when we're doing our expense management or our purchase management, all the control that we've set up around the budget will be based upon our plan that we've submitted. And a couple of other things that are worth noting. Each stage of the plan can have a different layout to work with. So here we configure the many different columns that we might make available to the layouts that we use. So for example, in our finance budget, we will have an actuals on this list. And what we do is we configure them to show the actuals data. So, okay, there we go. So actuals budget to date is based upon the scenario for actuals. And the budgeted scenario is based, so the column for the layout is based upon the budgeted scenario. And then we configure the actual layouts that are going to be used. So if we have a look at the first stage that we're going to use an initial finance targeted layout. And in here, what we say is the columns available in this layout are actuals to date, budgeted to date, and target. And the level of granularity that we're going to in terms of main accounts and dimensions, we're going quite granular. So we've got main accounts, business unit, department, region, and product at that level. So that's a high level configuration that we've got and we're going to use. So let's start off our plan. So we're going to go back to the budget planning workspace. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we are acting as the finance department. So I'm a user in finance department and I'm going to generate a forecast, so an initial plan before I distribute that out to my departments. So what I'm actually going to do is come over here onto the right hand side of my workspace and I'm going to generate a budget plan from the general ledger. So I'm creating a brand new budget plan because the budget plan does not exist as yet. I'm aggregating it by accounting year for my example here. I am dragging in data from the profit and loss, so it's a profit and loss based plan, and I'm bringing forward January and February figures. Okay, the budget planning process that I want to use for this is Forecast Plan 2018, which is the configuration that we've just looked at in the setup. My budget plan name can be whatever you want to call it, so we'll call it exactly the same as the planning process. And this data that I'm retrieving from the general ledger, well, what scenario do I want to populate? Well, it's actuals data, so I want the actuals data to be populated. And the responsibility center for this is the finance department, because that's where we're starting it off. So we've got everything set on our data, and we just need to generate that through. So let me just change our workspace to be the correct one. Okay, so once we have okay, so we've refreshed this workspace to be looking at the planning process that we're using, and we can see now that we now have a brand new plan for the Focus Plan 2018. So if we just open up that plan, so we got a document number here. And what we can see is we've got the start of our initial plan. So we've got all the data that's been brought through from the general ledger for all the different profit and loss type accounts. And it's brought that data into our actuals column. So they're the first 2 months. But what we want to do now is generate the rest of the financial year and populate the budgeted scenario with the rest of the financial year. So then we've got a forecast to work with. So we're going to do the same sort of thing. We could have done that from the plan itself, but let's be persistent and work with the workspace. So what we're going to do again is generate a budget plan from general ledger, the same option that we had before. This time we're going to ask it to look into 2017 and pick out from March to December. Profit and loss again. This time, be careful at the top, I nearly missed this one, but what we want to do is update an existing budget plan now with this scenario. So we've got this data, and this time we'll say, well, what document are we using? What document wants updating? So we'll select our one that was created on the last run. And the only difference this time as well is we're populating a different scenario in the plan, which is the budgeted scenario. Now, one of the things you can do, which might be relevant at this stage, is that because we're budgeting for the rest of the year, is we can factor, so we can look into 2017 and we might factor by a percentage, so 2% or something like that. However, we're not going to do that in my scenario because that's probably a little bit too generic because we're looking across all the profit and loss accounts. But what we can do is we can say, well, we'll only bring through values to the minimum of £1,000, which might be relevant in this scenario. And we can also have a rounding rule where we don't bring out around the pence, we're rounding up to the nearest £100. So we're going to go ahead with that, and we're going to generate the second part of our forecast. So that will take a minute or two. That's gone straight through. So what we'll do is, again, we'll go and view that document and see what status that particular document is in. So now we have, as you can see, we have two scenarios populated. We've got actuals to date and we've got budget for rest of the year. However, in the scenario that we're working with here, what we're going to do is, whilst we've got those figures, we might actually want to tweak those and before we distribute them down to the departments and say, well, I'd actually like each department to work with these numbers. So we might want to tweak what has been suggested as we've generated it from the general ledger. And as you can see, I didn't point this out earlier, but we're doing this at quite a granular level. We have got a main account, we've got a department, so that's department 22. I think we should have 3 departments in here. So we've got a sales department, a claims department, but department 23, and we've got finance, where this plan has been initiated from as 24, and 26, 27, 28, and we should have an IT department in there as well. Okay. So what you see, one of the things that I didn't mention in the budget planning process is that we have to set up a hierarchy that we're going to use for the budget planning process. So before we go and work with the target figures and then distribute that down to the departments, let's just go back and have a quick look at that so you'll understand how this gets distributed back out. Okay, so this is the plan that we looked at earlier and how this is set up, and the fact that we're using get on the right plan. Okay, so yeah. So this is the budget planning process that we're using in our example. So we're using a hierarchy that just has 4 departments on it, just to make this simple. So if we look at that hierarchy, we're starting off with finance, and that will get distributed out into sales, IT, and claims. So even though we brought more data into the actual plan from the general ledger, it's only going to focus on the sales department, the IT department, and the claims department in this top-down approach. Okay, so let's go back to our plan. So budget planning workspace. Let's go back into our document. So one of the things that we want to show here is that obviously we could edit this document right now, and we could start to build up what we want the target, so for our different departments to meet. So we could do that manually. That's definitely a possibility. We could copy the numbers from any of these scenarios into the target, so they don't have to manually go through each line. And that's using a process that would be copy the budget plan from one plan to another, and that will allow us to copy, for example, the budgeted scenario into the targeted scenario. So that's another option. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to use the worksheet that is attached to this particular layout for the initial plan. So we're going to open that up in Excel. Okay, so we've opened that up in Excel, and as you can see, what we've done is we have a template here that we've designed, and it's populated the data through from our scenario. So we've got our actuals data, we've got our budgeted data, we've got our targeted data at 0 currently. And you can see it's brought through things like the document number, who's preparing it, and we can add other data in here. So the revenue, if you like, for 2017, what's the target for 2018? So you can actually configure this template however you want it, and then attach it to one of the layouts that we're using throughout the process. So remember, the layout that we're using right now is called the initial finance plan layout, and I've attached this spreadsheet to that layout. And the reason why I've done that is because we can, as we're designing the template, we can add extra columns that aren't available in the UI. So we can put formulas in these columns. And that is achieved when we design this template by using the design functions. And in this case, it would be editing the layout, and we can add a formula option in here. And we can save that with the template. Now, this particular formula that I've done is a lookup, and it will help us, as I will explain as we go through, to do some basic driver-based planning. Okay, so what I've also done with this template is I've got an extra tab here called drivers. So if you remember from earlier in our demonstration, we had two scenarios. One was a loss ratio scenario, and one was a market share scenario. And what we've done with those, they have plans of their own in order to populate some numbers against the loss ratio and market share. So the idea here is we're bringing this data through from those budget planning scenarios. And we can see here that the market share for our region, Germany, for our product, personal accident, is actually 10%. For the same product, personal accident in the US, it's 20%. So we're bringing these through in order that we can use them where on sheet 1 in starting to plan our numbers. The loss ratio is related to the claims scenario so this bit here in the sheet. So what we're going to do is, and we also see that this is stored by, well, what's the loss ratio per product? So personal accidents, 54%, professional indemnity, 12%, public liability, 38%. But these can be whatever you want them to be. So my formula basically, as you can see here at the top, is basically a lookup. So it's looking up that data on the drivers, and it's going to split out the income and the losses or the claims. You can configure this however you need it to be. So let's come up with a scenario. So if I said our target in 2018 is to increase our revenue by 2%, I can say equals H5 times 1.02. And that will come up with a number at the top, but you can see straight away that all my sales data, so I'm aiming for 2.4 billion pounds, and if I just go down here on those letters, you'll see that on the calculator column, it has looked at the market share and calculated by region and by product what the share of that 2.4 billion target is applied to each region product. So again, it's just an example of using an Excel formula to be able to do that. And then the clever thing about, I guess, about this particular driver is then what it's done per region per product to say, well, if that up at the top here is actually 245 million, and the loss ratio for the product personal accident is 54%, then that is the value of claims we expect to pay based upon the turnover for that region, that product. So again, it's just a different method of being able to cleverly calculate figures that we might use for our plan. And you can see that when we based our budgeted column on 2017 figures and brought them through into this year's plan, they're not too far off the calculated figures. Again, this is optional, but it's a way that we can do driver-based planning. But the key thing is I need this column populated to be able to distribute that out into our departments. That is as simple as, if we're happy with those calculations, we can just say equals L10 and effectively copy the numbers across. Okay. So actually what we'll do here is round that up. Before we push that through. Okay, so there is more data down here. So there is more data that didn't come into my formulas. So my revenue and my cost of sales or claims or losses, if you like, that we might want to push through into our target. So miscellaneous expenses, for example, we might say, yeah, we'll go with the 9,900. With the claims, miscellaneous expenses, we'd like to make them try and achieve 5,000. So we can also obviously do this manually as well. So let's just do that for the others. So aim for 6,000 on advertising, aim for 11,000 and 30,000 for IT. Okay. So different ways of populating the data. And then all we have to do is publish that back. Wait till we get a confirmation that that's gone through. So just going to do a refresh on that data. And okay, so that's the data that should have gone through to our plan. So we go back to Dynamics, we'll open up the plan. And we should have some target data in there now, populated in our field. So we've got all that was calculated by using the Excel formulas, and we've also got our extra ones that we did manually in there. Okay. So the next stage in this process, now we've got a target for our individual departments to work with, is we are ready to submit that to the workflow. So one of the things we didn't mention in the configuration is a workflow will have to be configured to say how this the plans get distributed out to the departments. Now, as it happens, there is a couple of workflows, one for the finance department to distribute that out and then aggregate that back up. That is already in the Dynamics 365 Finance and Ops demonstration data. And when it gets down to a department level, the ability to submit that and the workflow around that is also readily available in the demonstration data. So I'm going to submit that to the workflow, and I can put some comments in here. So please review and submit. So that's gone through the workflow. So what we're going to do is just go back to our workspace again. Look at our list, and it may take a minute or two to go through the workflow, but what we should have as that comes through is a plan for each of the departments. Okay, so the workflow has finished, and as you can see from my workspace here, we have 3 new plans created that are linked to our initial plan. For each of the departments that was stated in our hierarchy for this budget planning process. So we have a department for a plan for sales, a plan for the IT department, and a plan for claims. So the idea would be that each user picks up their plan. So we'll have a look at the sales and marketing. And as you can see here, the target numbers have come from our top plan down to our department plan. And you can see here that all we're looking at is the figures that were attributed to department number 22. The figures in relation to the claims, which were linked dynamically to the claims department, our department 23, are not in this plan. We're only working with the figures that affect department number 22. So the idea here is that for each budget owner or approver at department level stage, they then go through and say, okay, this is my target, but what do I want to request? So am I happy with my target figures for the department by region by product? Or do I want to suggest that we might not meet those targets? What do I want to do? So we put that through. This is another scenario using a slightly different layout for the department. So we're using a layout that has the targeted scenario in it and a brand new one called department requested. So the idea is we edit these figures and then we submit them when we're happy with them to be reviewed and aggregated. So just go back one step. As you can see, each of the department plans has got a different budget plan preparer, and they've got a different assigned to. So what we're going to do is we'll go through those individually. We're going to update the department requested figures, and then we're going to simply use the workflow to actually submit those to the next stage as and when we're ready to do so. Okay, so in order for me to be able to do that in the demonstration, I am not any of those users. So what you can do in each of these is you can actually go into the workflow. You can view the history, and you can reassign this to yourself as a user so you can push these through. So I'm just going to pause this demonstration so that you don't have to watch me go through that process. I'm just going to reassign those, and I'll push 2 of them through and leave one available so we can look at it and push that to the workflow. Okay, so we'll pick this up so you can see from my current status of my plans that the plan for claims has been, the data has been input from that department, and that's been submitted for approval. The same for the IT department. The current status of that is been submitted for approval. However, my sales hasn't finished theirs yet, so we'll open that up. So you can see that the sales department is ready to submit this. They have put their numbers in, or what they're suggesting that they can meet as opposed to the target. And we can also see here at the bottom where we've got a comments column in this particular layout. Where we can add comments to individual lines. So more funds required for an exhibition in terms of advertising expense. So we can have that sort of request put into the plan. So all they need to do now is when they've gone through their numbers and they're ready to submit, we go to the workflow and we complete. We can put a comment, whatever those comments might be, and then again we're back in now and we're publishing that to the workflow. So again, we'll be waiting for the workflow to update, but they should all go into a submitted stage. So we'll just wait for that to go through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pick this back up. So finance, who initiated the plan, is going to pick the original plan back up, and they're going to aggregate all of those individual plans together for submission to the CFO for review, which is part of the next step in this planning process. So we'll just wait for that to update, and then we'll pick up this particular plan. Okay, so all of those departmental budget plans have been submitted. So as the finance user, if you like, or budget preparer, I'm going to open the initial plan. And now what you could do in this scenario is you could have this particular layout at the aggregation stage could actually show what was budgeted, what was targeted, and then you could see the department requested. However, in my particular scenario here, the role of the initiator of the plan, the finance department, all they're doing at this stage is pushing it further along in the workflow, completing it, and part of that completion process, which again is part of the workflow, will aggregate the numbers of the departmental plans and push that for CFO review. So there is no further review required from the initiator of the original plan. The department plans will go straight through to CFO. So this particular person is doing in this particular flow is completing that. So we're asking the CFO to please review and approve. So we're completing that stage. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to stay in this plan so we can wait for the workflow to finish. And this planning stage should get updated because we've now told the workflow to do the aggregate function. And this should change status to under CFO review. And then we'll pick up the plan from there in terms of what the CFO does from that stage. Okay, so we can see now that the workflow has finished. It's updated our plan to say it's under CFO review. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to log into Dynamics as the CFO to view it from their perspective and push that to plan through to final approved status. So down here at the bottom, we log into Dynamics 365 and we'll go to the budget planning workspace and we'll filter on the budget planning process that we're using, and you can see straight away on the workspace that we've got budget plans assigned to me for the CFO. So we're going to click on this one. Here's the budget plan. I'm going to open up that document. And we can see straight away. Now, what we might actually do in a real life scenario at CFO level is that this might not be as granular as this particular workflow is, planning process is, where we've still got the departments, regions and products. We might actually just build that up to be at department level. However, you can see the numbers have come through, so the CFO can see what was targeted, what the target number was for each department, region and product level, and actually what the departments are actually requesting. So you'll see that we've got the sales department in here. We've then got the claims figures, so they have been aggregated together. And then we've got some miscellaneous expenses or advertising expenses, as you can see, coming through for each of the different departments. So again, in this scenario, it's all about same at as the other levels really. What is the CFO approving? So we've got another scenario in this mix. So slightly different layout in terms of just the scenarios. We're seeing the targeted, we're seeing the department requested, we're seeing what the CFO is likely to approve. Now, one of the things we could have done that isn't in the workflow is as part of the workflow, we could have auto-populated this column to be the exact match of the department requested, and then the CFO could review by exception rather than having to go down each of the individual lines. However, what we can do, obviously, the CFO can edit this. They can open up in the worksheet and work on the numbers, which might give a little bit more flexibility as we did before, and then publish those back in. Or what they can do is we can do the same process as we did before. So we can add from a budget plan. So this may not be a real life scenario, but just to show you what we can do. And this is in effect copying over. So again, we're going to update an existing budget plan scenario. We're going to, so the budget planning process that we're going to use is the one that we've been using today, this one. And the document that we're going to use is 185. And what we're going to use is the source is the department requested column. And what we want to do is the target is populate the column called CFO approved. So it's just a method of copying the data from one column to another. So we submit that, and that should come through. Just close out of that plan, go back in, and you can see that just wait for that to refresh again. So just had to go out of the plan and go back in for refreshing purposes, but you can see that the numbers have been copied across from the department requested scenario to the CFO approved. So now the CFO can in fact manage by exception, look at these individual numbers, which might not be so granular as they are in this particular scenario. And when the CFO is ready, all they have to do is go to the next stage of the workflow, which is to actually push those to be approved. So that will update the workflow. It will also update the workspace. So if we have a look at those particular plans again, we should see that the CFO has no longer got anything to do in budgets plans assigned to me. So they should go on in the workflow, and to finish this process off, all we have to do then, that plan is approved. We're going to go back to the original workspace, and that's where the finance department, if they're the right people to do so, can pick that approved plan up, push that into the budget register entries. And the reason why we do that is because when budget register entries are completed, they then effectively make available the budget control. So it uses the budget register entry figures to affect the settings and configuration we've got around budget control. So we're going to go ahead and switch back into the original user in Dynamics and have a look at it. So as you can see back in Dynamics 365, the original finance user, budget plan number 185 is now actually fully approved. So all we have to do from our workspace is we have an option. So like we generated budget plans from the general ledger, we have an option to generate budget register entries. So the source is our budget planning process 2018. Our document number is 185, and our scenario is CFO approved. We can then say, okay, the target will push through for today. The budget model is 2018, and the budget code is this is going to be the original budget. We can generate that, and that will create some budget register entries based upon that plan. So we'll go and review those entries. Okay, so if we go into budgeting and budget register entries, we should have a record in here created today, original budget 2018. It's in draft format, and basically all those entries from the original budget plan have now got a register entry in here, along with all the comments that came through from the department. So they've all come through. And all we have to do at that status is actually update the budget balances. And at that point, that particular register entry is confirmed, and that's where budget control will then kick in. So what we'll do is we'll just cover what is budget control, what's the configuration around that, and how does that work. So for example, we might choose that this account here, 601300, which is advertising expense, we might have want control over that. So we've got a budget here, an approved budget of £32,000 for advertising expense for department number 25. And that's where we can then configure control over that, so that when purchases are created or expense management is created, budget checks take place, and they will either pass or fail. And then we have additional functionality around budget control, where if the budget check fails, we can request extra budget, etc. But this is why we publish them to budget register entries. So we're going to have a look in budget control setup. Okay, so what we want to do is to go into budgeting, budget control configuration. And we'll just do this at a very high level, but you can determine at what level budget control is going to be monitored. So the likelihood is, if I've pushed my plan at the granular level that I did with regions and projects, that we probably want those same controls at budget control level, but we do have the ability to amalgamate that up and say no, for budget control purposes, we don't have to go that granular. It can be done at department level. The next item is, how does it calculate what budget funds are available? So we can include the original budget, which is where we published our register entries to, and budget revisions and transfers. So we can transfer budgets between different departments, for example. And subtracting from the budget that we've had approved would be actual expenditures in my scenario here, and unposted expenditures. So that might be where you've had expense management that where expenses have been submitted but not yet approved. Okay. And then defining budget control rules. So we talked about the advertising section. So what we can say is we can create a rule that says, for advertising, if it's this main account or range of main accounts, then that's the rule I want you to impose. And when it gets to 90% of the threshold, we ought to be warning around that, and that's what our budget control is going to be defined again. So there's lots more different levels and a little bit more configuration, but that is where budget control comes in. Okay, so that summarizes at a very high level the whole planning process. So we've got many components that we need to configure before this works, but that's an example of a top-down budget where we start with the finance department, distribute to the departments underneath finance. They work on their own budget plans. Those are aggregated, approved by CO, go into budget register entries, which are also approved or closed off, and that's where our budget control comes through. Thank you.